Spring of 1915. The Western Front of the First World War was frozen in the deadly embrace of trench warfare. Positional battles exhausted the forces of both sides, and breaking through the defenses seemed impossible. In this stalemate, the command's attention was drawn to a small section of the front in northern Belgium, the Ypres salient. The marshy lowland, crisscrossed by canals and streams, became a key strategic point, the last bastion protecting the English Channel ports from German capture. Here, on the damp Flemish soil, the defense lines of French colonial troops, Canadian volunteers, and British expeditionary forces met. Opposite them was the 4th German Army under the command of Duke Albrecht of Württemberg, striving at any cost to break through the Allied positions. In the headquarters, alarming rumors were already circulating about the Germans preparing something unheard of, a weapon against which there was no defense. No one yet suspected that soon the quiet fields of Ypres would become the first laboratory of mass chemical destruction in history. In the late 19th century, global science was rapidly developing, opening new horizons of knowledge to humanity. But along with beneficial discoveries, others were born that could bring death. Chemistry, that ancient science of alchemists, in the hands of the military, turned into a tool of mass destruction. The idea of using chemical substances on the battlefield was not new. Even during the Crimean War, British chemist Lyon Playfair proposed using shells with cyanides against Russian ships. However, his proposal was rejected as uncivilized and inhumane. In 1899, at the Hague Conference, leading powers signed an agreement prohibiting the use of projectiles whose sole purpose was the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. But prolonged trench warfare changed the rules of the game. Germany, caught in the grip of a naval blockade and experiencing a shortage of conventional ammunition, sought an asymmetric response. At this moment, Fritz Haber entered the scene. A brilliant chemist, a German patriot, and a future Nobel laureate. A man whose fate became the embodiment of the tragic contradiction between science and morality. Haber, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry and Electrochemistry in Berlin, proposed to the military command the use of chlorine, a byproduct of the chemical industry, as a combat toxic agent. The greenish gas with a sharp odor, heavier than air, forming hydrochloric acid upon contact with moisture, could literally burn out the lungs of enemy soldiers. "Death is death," Haber said, justifying his work, no matter how it comes. In the German command, the idea caused heated debate. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the General Staff, saw chemical weapons as a chance to overcome the stalemate on the front. Kaiser Wilhelm II, initially skeptical of inhumane weapons, eventually gave his consent to their use. However, some high-ranking officers of the old Prussian school considered a gas attack unworthy of a soldier's honor. Under Haber's leadership, large-scale preparations began. Tests were conducted at training grounds, and methods for delivering toxic substances to enemy positions were developed. Initially, the Germans experimented with artillery shells filled with chemicals. In January 1915, on the Eastern Front near Bolimov, they used shells with xylyl bromide against Russian positions, but the frost minimized the effect. The substance froze and did not evaporate. For the Ypres salient, another method was chosen, the direct release of gas from cylinders installed in forward trenches. By April 1915, the Germans had delivered about 5,000 cylinders of chlorine to the positions, more than 160 tons of deadly gas. April 22, 1915. Nothing on this spring day foretold that it would forever change the face of war. The weather was ideal for the Germans' planned operation. Clear skies and a steady northeast wind blowing at 2 to 3 meters per second directly towards the Allied positions. Better conditions for a gas attack could not have been wished for. On the northern section of the Ypres salient, between the villages of Langemarck and Steenstraat, a tense bustle reigned in the German trenches. Soldiers in unusual rubber masks were installing and checking heavy steel cylinders dug into the parapets of the trenches. 5,600 cylinders of chlorine awaited their moment. Opposite, in the Allied trenches, French colonial troops, Algerian and Moroccan riflemen, and the Canadian division had no inkling of the impending catastrophe. Few paid attention to the strange hiss that emanated from the enemy trenches around 1700 hours, and then they saw it. A strange, greenish-yellow cloud, slowly creeping along the ground towards them. At first, we thought it was a smoke screen to cover an attack, one of the surviving French officers later recalled. But when the cloud approached, real hell began. The Algerian riflemen were the first to feel the effects of the gas. A suffocating wave of chlorine enveloped their positions, causing excruciating coughing, blindness, and suffocation. Soldiers clutched their throats. Their lungs felt as if they were being burned from within. Panic gripped the front lines. Those who could move rushed to flee, abandoning weapons and equipment. They ran like a herd of crazed animals, wrote one British observer, with bulging eyes and rasping throats, many falling as they ran, gasping for air like fish thrown onto the shore. Within minutes, a breach approximately 6 kilometers wide formed in the Allied lines. German infantry, following the gas cloud, met with only weak resistance. The Canadians on the right flank of the attack found themselves in a critical situation. Their left flank was completely exposed. Confusion reigned in Allied headquarters. Reports from the front seemed fantastic. General Ferdinand Foch, commander of the northern group of French armies, could not believe the reports of a green cloud killing people. The British command under General John French was also unprepared for such a turn of events. Individual units displayed miracles of ingenuity in attempts to defend themselves. Some soldiers, recalling chemistry lessons, soaked handkerchiefs and nose coverings in their own urine. The ammonia in it partially neutralized the chlorine. Others dug into the ground, trying to find clean air. By nightfall, the situation had stabilized. The Germans, not expecting such success and lacking sufficient reserves, were unable to fully exploit the breakthrough created by the gas. The Canadians, at the cost of enormous losses, held the flank, counterattacking even without protective equipment. By the morning of April 23rd, it became clear the war had entered a new, even more brutal phase. Chemical weapons had emerged from laboratories onto the battlefields, and this genie would not return to the bottle. Chlorine, a treacherous killer. Heavier than air, it spread across the ground, filling every trench, every crater, every dugout. Soldiers exposed to the gas began a torturous chain of reactions. First, a sharp burning sensation in the eyes and nasopharynx. Then, bronchial spasms and agonizing coughing. Chlorine, combining with the moisture of mucous membranes, formed hydrochloric acid, literally burning out the lungs from the inside. "I saw their eyes," wrote Canadian medic William Burchell in his diary, "wide with terror and pain. They gasped for air like fish thrown onto the shore. Their faces turned blue, then black. Some tried to say something, but only a wheeze escaped their throats." Medics were powerless against the new weapon. No one was prepared for such a turn of events. Field hospitals overflowed with the dying, to whom doctors could offer only morphine to alleviate suffering. Many soldiers who survived the first hours after poisoning later died from pulmonary edema, their lungs filled with fluid, and they literally drowned on dry land. Surviving French Captain Pierre Dubois recalled, "My men fell like mown grass. Those who could speak begged for water. Their throats and lungs burned with fire. We soaked handkerchiefs and applied them to their faces, but it helped little." In a desperate attempt to protect themselves, soldiers used everything at hand. Handkerchiefs soaked in water, or more effectively in urine, were applied to the nose and mouth. Ammonia partially neutralized the chlorine. Some Canadians figured out to use earth. They buried their faces in the mud or applied wet earth to their noses, creating a primitive filter. British Lieutenant Clive Staples Lewis, the future famous writer, described these improvisations. Men tore their shirts apart, soaked them in water from canteens and ditches. Officers gave up their scarves. Someone thought to use sandbags. They were soaked and applied to the face. It looked gruesome, people with bags on their heads. But for some, it saved their lives. Among Canadian soldiers, a rumor spread that urine neutralized the gas better than water. Many urinated on handkerchiefs or sleeves before applying them to their faces. In some cases, this indeed helped. The ammonia in the urine reacted with chlorine. Those who didn't even have a handkerchief at hand buried their faces in the ground, trying to find a breath of clean air. Some soldiers instinctively climbed as high as possible, scrambling onto trench parapets or trees, escaping the gas spreading along the ground. When the green cloud of chlorine dispersed over the fields of Ypres, British command faced a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. A 6-kilometer gap yawned in the defensive line, and the surviving French units retreated in panic. At this critical moment, the fate of the entire front rested in the hands of the British and Canadians, who were tasked with halting the German advance without protection from gas or training for such an attack. The 1st Canadian Division, comprised mainly of volunteers and recently arrived at the front, found itself at the epicenter of the chemical storm. Their left flank was completely exposed after the flight of French colonial troops. Division Commander Major General Edwin Alderson made a decision many considered suicidal: to counterattack in the direction of the gas cloud. "We were ordered to advance," Captain Francis Scrimgeour of the Canadian Medical Corps later recalled. Men marched, covering their faces with wet handkerchiefs, coughing and stumbling. Many fell, but the rest continued. It was an act of incredible bravery. Fighting under unbearable conditions, the Canadians managed to hold their positions near the village of St. Julien, though the price was horrific. Of the 800 men of the 10th Battalion, fewer than 200 remained fit for duty by morning. The 13th Battalion lost more than half its personnel, but held key heights. British command hastily redeployed reinforcements. General Horace Smith Dorrien, commander of the 2nd Corps, organized a new defensive line, using all available reserves. Soldiers were given improvised means of protection: cotton gauze bandages soaked in a solution of soda or hyposulfite. The artillerymen particularly distinguished themselves. British batteries fired almost continuously, despite being themselves under the influence of gas. Artillery Captain Edward Bell, whose battery was at the spearhead of the German attack, continued to direct fire even as his men succumbed to poisoning. He died at his post, giving commands until his last breath. On the night of April 22nd to 23rd, British command decided to counterattack. Despite the lack of sufficient reserves and gas protection, it was the only way to prevent a complete breakthrough of the front. British and Canadian units went on the offensive, using tactics of short rushes. Small groups of soldiers dashed from cover to cover, gradually reclaiming lost positions. General John French, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, later wrote, "Had it not been for the steadfastness of the Canadians and the resourcefulness of our commanders on the ground, the entire Ypres salient would have been lost within 24 hours, and after it, the road to the Channel ports." By April 24th, the situation had stabilized. At the cost of enormous sacrifices, the Allies held most of the Ypres salient, though they were forced to retreat to new positions. The gap in the defense was closed, but the lesson was learned. The war had entered a new, even more inhumane phase. The deadly cloud of chlorine, first used at Ypres, caught the Allies off guard, revealing a terrible truth. Science had created a weapon against which soldiers were defenseless. The desperate race for protective measures began literally the day after the first gas attack. In laboratories in Great Britain and France, scientists worked around the clock. The first to propose an effective solution was the British chemist Lieutenant Harrison, who, by April 24, 1915, had developed a primitive but effective respirator. It consisted of a gauze bandage soaked in a solution of sodium thiosulfate and soda, substances that neutralize chlorine. "We needed to create protection immediately," Harrison later recalled. "We used everything at hand: gauze from hospitals, chemicals from laboratories. Soldiers called our invention a wet rag, but it saved thousands of lives." The first batches of such bandages were made right in the field. Nurses and medics worked around the clock, cutting gauze and soaking it in protective solutions. By early May, tens of thousands of such respirators had arrived at the front. However, these primitive means of protection had serious drawbacks. They quickly dried out, losing effectiveness, restricted vision, and made breathing difficult. A more advanced solution was needed. The breakthrough came thanks to British chemist Edward Harrison and physiologist John Haldane. They developed a box respirator containing layers of chemically treated fabric and activated charcoal. This device, named the Harrison respirator, provided significantly better protection and comfort. The French took a different path. Their scientists created the M2 gas mask, a mask made of rubberized fabric with goggles and a filter filled with neutralizing substances. By the summer of 1915, such gas masks began to arrive in the troops. Russian engineers, having received information about gas attacks on the Western Front, developed their own Zelinsky-Kumant gas mask, which many historians consider the first truly effective means of protection. It used activated charcoal as a universal adsorbent. The Germans, who initiated chemical warfare, also improved their means of protection. Their Gummischutzmaske, with a cylindrical filter, became a model to emulate. By the autumn of 1915, the gas mask had become as essential an item of a soldier's equipment as a rifle or helmet. Training in the use of this life-saving device was conducted in special gas chambers, tents filled with a weak concentration of chlorine or tear gas. 15 seconds was the time a soldier had to put on a gas mask, said British instructor William Livesey. Delay meant death. The effectiveness of the new protective measures was confirmed during the second major gas attack at Ypres in May 1915. Although the Germans released twice as much chlorine as in April, casualties were significantly lower. Most soldiers managed to put on primitive respirators. The technological race between offensive and defensive weapons was just beginning. Each new poisonous substance required improvements to gas masks. This deadly spiral of innovation continued throughout the war, claiming the lives of those who could not keep pace with it. The first gas attack at Ypres demonstrated the deadly potential of chemical weapons. But it was only the beginning. German chemists, emboldened by their initial success, set about developing even more effective chemical warfare agents. Chlorine, for all its lethality, had significant drawbacks. It was easily detected by its characteristic odor and greenish color, and primitive protective measures quickly learned to neutralize its effects. In Fritz Haber's laboratories, a new weapon was born: phosgene. This colorless gas, with a faint odor of moldy hay, proved to be 10 times more toxic than chlorine. Its insidious nature lay in its delayed action. Soldiers exposed to phosgene might not experience serious symptoms for several hours. They would return to their shelters, eat, sleep, and then suddenly begin to suffocate. Edema would develop in their lungs, leading to an agonizing death. "Phosgene gave no chance," wrote British medic James Patterson in his memoirs. "A soldier could appear perfectly healthy, joke with comrades, and 12 hours later lie dead with foam at his mouth." The Germans first employed phosgene in December 1915, mixing it with chlorine for concealment. The result exceeded all expectations. The Allies lost approximately 9,000 men, of whom over 1,000 died. But the true apotheosis of chemical warfare was the emergence of mustard gas, a substance that received its ominous name in honor of the location of the first gas attack. Dichlorodieethyl sulfide, known as mustard gas, was first used by the Germans again at Ypres in July 1917. Mustard gas proved to be a truly diabolical invention. Unlike chlorine and phosgene, it not only affected the respiratory tract, but also attacked the skin, eyes, and caused internal and external burns. Yellowish-brown droplets settling on the ground, clothing, and weapons retained their deadly properties for weeks. The gas even penetrated the rubber of early gas masks. "We called it King of Gases," recalled German chemist Wilhelm Mayer. "It rendered useless all the protective measures the Allies had developed against our previous gases." The first mustard gas attack led to the emergence of a new type of war victim. Soldiers with huge blisters on their skin, blinded, with burned lungs, filled field hospitals. Many of them died within weeks in terrible torment. The medical consequences of mustard gas exposure proved to be long-term and devastating. Survivors suffered from chronic lung diseases, increased susceptibility to respiratory infections, and blindness. Decades later, many developed lung, larynx, and skin cancer. Mustard gas proved to be a powerful carcinogen, damaging cellular DNA. Nurse Vera Britton, who worked in a field hospital, described the victims of mustard gas. Their skin blistered and peeled off, revealing raw flesh underneath. Their eyes became cloudy white cataracts. They couldn't speak. Their vocal cords were burned. All they could do was gasp and beg for morphine. By the end of the war, chemical weapons had claimed the lives of approximately 90,000 soldiers and maimed over 1 million. Ypres, the site of the first gas attack, gave its name to the most terrible of poisonous substances, becoming a symbol of a new, technological face of war: impersonal, scientific, devoid of any chivalry or humanity. When the greenish cloud of chlorine dissipated over the fields of Ypres, its deadly legacy remained not only in the mutilated bodies of soldiers, but also in the very Belgian soil. For the civilian population of this small Flemish region, chemical warfare brought suffering comparable to biblical disasters. Local residents caught in the combat zone became involuntary witnesses and victims of a new weapon. The gas did not distinguish between military and civilian. The poisonous cloud penetrated peasant homes, cellars where families hid, barns and stables. Animals died first. Their bodies carpeted the surrounding fields. "Our land was dying before our eyes," recalled Maria van der Hagen, a resident of a village near Ypres. The grass yellowed and dried, trees lost their leaves as if in autumn, though it was April. Birds fell dead from the sky. We were afraid to drink water from the wells, thinking it was poisoned. Chemical substances, especially mustard gas, penetrated deep into the soil, making entire areas of land unsuitable for cultivation for many years. Agriculture, the foundation of the region's economy, was destroyed. Farmers who returned after evacuation found their fields transformed into a dead zone. But not only nature became a victim of the war. The historic center of Ypres, a city whose history spanned more than 1,000 years, was wiped off the face of the earth. Medieval cathedrals, the town hall, unique Flemish houses, all turned into ruins under the continuous artillery bombardments that followed the gas attacks. Particularly tragic was the fate of the Cloth Hall, a magnificent Gothic complex from the 13th century, a symbol of the prosperity of medieval Flanders. By the end of 1917, only charred walls and piles of stones remained of the building, wrote Belgian architect Jules Cloquet. For the Belgian people, Ypres became a symbol of national tragedy and, at the same time, of national unity and resilience. Under German occupation, which lasted almost the entire war, the local population showed amazing solidarity and mutual assistance. In the basements of destroyed houses, underground schools emerged, where children continued to learn despite constant shelling. Improvised hospitals, organized by local residents, admitted both wounded soldiers and civilians affected by gas attacks. Nurse Elizabeth Dumont, who worked in such a hospital, recalled, "After the war, Ypres became a place of pilgrimage for those who wanted to honor the memory of the victims of the First Chemical War." The Belgian government decided not to fully restore the city, leaving some of the ruins as a reminder of the horror experienced. However, the residents of Ypres themselves thought differently. Declared the city's mayor, "We want to rebuild our home to show that life is stronger than death." Within 20 years after the war, Ypres was restored almost to its original state. The famous Cloth Hall, St. Martin's Cathedral, and other historical buildings rose from the ruins, becoming a symbol of the rebirth of the Belgian nation. The use of chemical weapons on the fields of Ypres shook the world community to its core. April 22, 1915, became not just the date of a military operation. It transformed into a moral Rubicon that humanity crossed, opening Pandora's box of modern warfare. The international reaction was immediate and virtually unanimous. Even neutral countries expressed deep indignation at Germany's actions. The Hague Convention of 1899, signed by 26 states, including Germany, unequivocally forbade the use of projectiles, the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. The German command found a formal loophole in this wording. Chlorine was released not from projectiles, but from cylinders. This legalistic quibbling could not conceal the obvious violation of the spirit of international law. "Germany has crossed the last boundary of civilized warfare," declared British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith. "The use of poisons against enemy soldiers takes us back to the times of barbarism." The French press called the gas attack a crime against humanity, and President Raymond Poincaré promised that those responsible would be held accountable after the war. Even in neutral United States, newspapers were filled with headlines condemning German barbarism and poisoners in uniform. However, moral condemnation did not prevent the Allies from quickly establishing their own chemical weapon production. Within a few months, the British used chlorine against German positions at Loos, and the French developed their own chemical shells. The logic of war proved stronger than ethical principles. No one wanted to remain unarmed in the face of a new, deadly weapon. Particularly tragic was the moral dilemma of the scientists involved in the development of chemical weapons. Fritz Haber, a brilliant chemist, the father of chemical warfare, embodied this internal conflict. His wife Clara, also a chemist, was so shocked by her husband's role in creating weapons of mass destruction that after Haber's return from the Ypres front, she committed suicide with his service pistol. Haber himself justified his work as a patriotic duty. "In peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world," he said, "but in wartime, he belongs to his country." This stance did not save him from the contempt of his colleagues. When Haber was awarded the Nobel Prize for ammonia synthesis in 1919, many scientists boycotted the ceremony. After the Nazis came to power, Haber's fate acquired a tragic irony. As a Jew, despite all his services to Germany, he was forced to leave the country in 1933. Haber died in exile in Switzerland, and many members of his family later perished in the gas chambers of concentration camps, a monstrous development of the technology he had pioneered. International law reacted to the horrors of chemical warfare only after its end. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly prohibited Germany from producing and stockpiling chemical weapons. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol was signed, prohibiting the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, or other similar gases in war. However, it did not prohibit the development and accumulation of such weapons, which led to the creation of vast arsenals in the interwar period. The Ypres salient became not only a place of military tragedy, but also a turning point in the history of international humanitarian law. Humanity realized the need to establish clearer boundaries of what is permissible even in conditions of total war. But this lesson came at too high a price, the price of thousands of soldiers suffocated in toxic clouds, forever changing our understanding of what modern warfare is. When the horrifying news of the gas attacks at Ypres reached the Eastern Front, Russian and Polish society was shocked. A new dimension of war, crossing all conceivable boundaries of humanity, sparked a wave of indignation and fear. For Russia and Poland, whose armies were already enduring the hardships of a protracted war, the emergence of chemical weapons meant a new level of trials. The first reports of gas attacks arrived in Petrograd through diplomatic channels and the foreign press. Newspapers like Ruskoye Slovo and Novoye Vremya published shocking photographs of suffocating soldiers and descriptions of their suffering. One Russian war correspondent wrote, "What happened near the Belgian town with the unpronounceable name goes beyond the bounds of war. This is extermination, similar to how rats are poisoned." For the Imperial Russian Army, the threat became a reality as early as May 1915, when the Germans used chemical weapons in the area of the Polish town of Bolimów. It was then that Russian soldiers first encountered white death, as they called the chlorine clouds spreading across the ground. "We saw a strange mist creeping along the ground," recalled Second Lieutenant Alexei Nikolaev of the Siberian Rifle Regiment. "No one understood what was happening until people started falling, clutching their throats. We were not ready for such a hell." Unlike the British and French, who had gained bitter experience at Ypres, the Russian army lacked even primitive means of protection. In the early days, soldiers used wet rags and even their own urine to somehow protect themselves from the gas. The losses were horrific. In just one attack at Bolimów, over 9,000 people were affected. Russian chemist Nikolai Zelinsky, shaken by the scale of the tragedy, quickly developed the first effective charcoal gas mask. His invention saved thousands of lives and was subsequently adopted by all warring countries. However, mass production of gas masks took many months, during which Russian soldiers remained practically defenseless. In Polish society, divided among three empires, The reaction to chemical warfare was particularly painful. Polish lands became an arena of brutal battles, and Polish soldiers fought on both sides of the front. For them, gas attacks symbolized a particular cynicism of war, where brother could kill brother with an invisible weapon. The Warsaw newspaper Kurier Polski wrote, "Our land, already tormented by shells and soaked in blood, is now poisoned. What will remain of Poland after such a war? Who will be able to live on these fields of death?" Polish doctors working in frontline hospitals were among the first to encounter the consequences of gas attacks. Dr. Tadeusz Brzezinski from Jagiellonian University left detailed records of the symptoms and treatment methods for victims of various poisonous substances. His work subsequently became the basis for medical protocols across Europe. When the last shots of the Great War died down, the scarred land of the Ypres salient held not only shell fragments and unexploded mines, but also the memory of tens of thousands of fallen. The restoration of this devastated region began almost immediately after the armistice. The Belgian government faced a difficult choice: to leave Ypres in wounds as a reminder of the war, or to restore the city to its historic appearance. After long debates, a compromise was reached to restore the historical center, but to create a ring of memorials around it, commemorating the fallen. The restoration of Ypres became one of the most ambitious projects in post-war Europe. Architects, led by Jules Coquet, meticulously recreated medieval buildings from preserved photographs and drawings. The famous Cloth Hall, the symbol of the city, was rebuilt stone by stone. The work continued for more than 20 years and was completed only by the early 30s. However, the main legacy of the Battle of Ypres was not the restored buildings, but the memorials scattered throughout the former battlefield. The most famous of these is the Menin Gate, a monumental arch built by the British in 1927. Engraved on its walls are the names of 54,689 soldiers of the British Empire who died at Ypres and have no known graves. The list turned out to be so long that it did not fit completely. The names of another 34,000 soldiers were carved on the walls of the Tyne Cot Memorial. Every evening, precisely at 20 o'clock, the last post sounds under the arches of the Menin Gate, a moving ceremony that has not been interrupted since 1928, with the exception of the period of German occupation during the Second World War. Buglers from the local fire brigade play a mournful melody in memory of the fallen. This ceremony has become one of the most poignant rituals of remembrance in modern Europe. The French created their memorial on Kemmel Hill, a monument with the figure of a grieving woman, symbolizing France mourning her sons. The Canadians built a magnificent monument on Vimy Ridge, where their troops won an important victory in April 1917. The Belgians erected the Iron Fleming Memorial, a statue of a soldier standing guard over his land. A special place among the memorials is occupied by Essex Farm, the farm where the first gas attack took place. Today, it houses a museum of chemical warfare, whose exhibits tell of the terrible consequences of using poisonous substances and the development of means of protection against them. Ypres became not only a place of sorrow, but also a symbol of reconciliation. In 1958, the first joint ceremony involving former adversaries took place at the Langemark Cemetery, where thousands of German soldiers are buried. German veterans, together with British and Belgian ones, laid wreaths at the graves of the fallen, symbolically ending the enmity that began almost half a century ago. Today, the Ypres salient is a huge open-air museum. Hundreds of cemeteries with neat rows of white crosses and headstones are scattered throughout the area. Each of them holds its own story: the story of a regiment, a battalion, or even an individual whose life ended here on Flemish soil. Ypres is not just a dot on the map of World War I battlefields. It is a place where humanity crossed an invisible line, beyond which war became truly total and inhumane. The green cloud of chlorine, released on April 22, 1915, dissipated within a few hours, but its shadow extends to this day, reminding us how dangerous it is to let the genie of scientific discoveries out of the bottle of morality. After the horror of Ypres, the international community realized the need to restrict the use of such weapons. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 became the first serious step in this direction, prohibiting the use of asphyxiating, poisonous, and other similar gases, as well as bacteriological methods of warfare. However, the document had a significant drawback. It only prohibited the use, but not the development and production of chemical weapons. This loophole allowed leading powers to accumulate significant arsenals of poisonous substances by the beginning of World War II. Hitler's Germany, which created new types of nerve agents such as sarin and tabun, was ready to use them on the battlefields. What stopped a new chemical catastrophe? Paradoxically, it was the fear of mutual destruction. Both sides understood that the response would be immediate and crushing. The tragic irony of history. The technology developed by Fritz Haber for military use was perfected by the Nazis for the mass extermination of people in concentration camps. Zyklon B, created based on Haber's research, took millions of lives in gas chambers, including relatives of the scientist himself. After World War II, attempts to ban chemical weapons resumed with renewed vigor. However, the Cold War and the arms race led to the creation of even more deadly substances, V gases in the USA and Soviet analogs. Stockpiles of poisonous substances grew, peaking in the 1970s. Despite international prohibitions, chemical weapons continued to be used in local conflicts. Italy used mustard gas against Ethiopians in the 1930s. Japan used various poisonous substances in the war against China. The USA sprayed defoliants in Vietnam, destroying vegetation and indirectly harming the civilian population. Especially shocking was the use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Saddam Hussein's regime not only attacked Iranian troops with mustard gas and nerve agents, but also used chemical weapons against its own Kurdish citizens in Halabja. Thousands of civilians died an agonizing death, scenes terrifyingly reminiscent of the tragedy of Ypres 70 years later. Only in 1993 was the Chemical Weapons Convention signed, the first international treaty to ban an entire class of weapons of mass destruction. The document provided not only for the prohibition of use, but also for the development, production, and storage of chemical munitions, as well as mechanisms for monitoring the destruction of existing arsenals. Today, the world still lives under the shadow of Ypres. Events in Syria, where chemical weapons were used in the civil war, showed that the threat has not completely disappeared. The poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in British Salisbury with the nerve agent Novichok in the 2000s once again reminded the world of the danger of chemical poisonous substances. The Ypres salient today is a place of pilgrimage, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the danger of uncontrolled use of scientific achievements. Every evening, under the arches of the Menin Gate, the last post is played, not only in memory of the fallen, but also as a warning to the living, as a reminder that technological progress without moral limits can lead humanity to the brink of an abyss. The lesson of Ypres is simple and tragic. Science, put at the service of destruction, can create weapons capable of destroying us all. And only the collective will of the international community, only the memory of soldiers suffocating in a poisonous cloud, can prevent us from repeating this tragedy on an even more terrible scale.